Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Actually, more people than I expected to see CVSS before. That's good. And I'd like to start, before we begin, with a quick survey. So let me see those hands if you are already using CVSS before somehow, if you're currently using it. Okay, we get 2 people, not that much. And if you came here because maybe you intend to use CVSS before in the future, raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, okay, a bit more. 15, 20%, maybe. And raise your hands if you came here to find reasons not to use CVSS before. Don't look at me, maybe you want to convince your bosses that it's not a good standard. Nah, just kidding. So look at this ball, this single ball. Imagine it's a vulnerability. Maybe a single vulnerability, it's not the end of the world. You can focus all your attention on that ball and it will be fine. The systems we consume will always be vulnerable, right? But if you have now all these balls, vulnerabilities, all mixed up and a rubber duck doing God knows what in there, then you start to have a problem. Because as security professionals, our goal is to make sure that we can put as many security controls in place or try to patch as many vulnerabilities as realistically possible to prevent exploitation. But that's not always easy if you don't really know how to do it, which vulnerabilities to handle first. Maybe you can start by grouping them somehow, maybe finding some common characteristics. You can start talking about severity, find a way to sort them by severity. And that's when you come up with CVSS. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And it's defined as a vendor-agnostic industry open standard that is owned and managed by FIRST. FIRST is a US-based nonprofit organization that was originally created to help security incident response teams across the world, now managing CVSS among other things. And it was adopted from the beginning by Mitro, another very important US-based organization that runs the CVE program. Again, not just the CVE program, but it was associated with CVEs from the beginning, the CVSS standard, and it soon became adopted by everyone, becoming the #1 scoring standard for vulnerabilities. And the idea is that it will convey characteristics and severity of software vulnerability. Bear these 2 terms in mind because they are really, really important, characteristics and severity. So really quick about me, I'm from Portugal. I'm curious, I guess I have to be in this line of work, right? I consider myself a cybersecurity enthusiast. So I'm an application security analyst for Checkmarks for around 4 years. Now I practice and I teach Krav Maga, and I love to read, I love to write and travel. But enough about me, let's talk about what we came here for. So we came here to talk about the latest version of CVSS. And why have a version 4? Well, of course, to improve upon version 3.1, but the idea is that there wasn't, first of all, a lot of granularity when you had to provide precise severity scores, so you would often end with 2 distinct scores for vulnerabilities that have nothing to do with each other, and you would often get that same score for both vulnerabilities, which wasn't that good. And also options themselves were limited. You could define, for instance, user interaction. Now you can define whether it's active or passive. You can have some more types. Also scope, you can now define specifically where is the impact, not just if there's a scope change, but you can say whether the impact is on a vulnerable and subsequent system, whereas you couldn't before. And parameters and what they are supposed to describe. Sometimes they left some room for doubt. For instance, attack complexity. You can read the manual and know what attack complexity means. But in reality, do we really know what attack complexity means? Because I don't. So also, everything was a 9.8. This is a common problem I hear everyone talk about because, well, not everything, but most of the times everything feels at least like a 9.8. You get a lot of 9.8 scores about a lot of vulnerabilities, and how critical is that? Like, it's as critical as it gets almost, and you don't really know how to prioritize in the end if everything is a 9.8. And why the hell not? Of course, if you have one version, they are always trying to improve. There's limitations. Let's try to improve it then. And in terms of metrics group, so I want to dive just a bit deeper into the standard with version 4. There was some changes. Base metrics, the group stays the same, but of course there are changes inside. The temporal metrics group was changed and renamed to actually be called threat metrics to better reflect what it's doing now. And the environmental metrics, pretty much the same besides some specifications. Supplemental metrics group is an entirely new group. So let's see, the base metrics group is the base, as the name can tell us. It's mandatory. It's pretty much the only group that most people are using because it's the first one and the easiest to use. The idea is that it will convey intrinsic characteristics about the vulnerability that are usually general across user environments and don't change over time, but that's not really true. As you know, it depends on the specific use case of what's affected. But the idea is that it will allow it to convey general characteristics. And the first, probably most important change in this table is the attack requirements, because before you would have attack complexity for everything. And as I said, it was kind of a blur, so we didn't really know what it meant. Now with attack requirements, you can clearly define that the attack will become more difficult because there are certain preconditions in the environment, like execution or just some specific context that is introduced by variables that will make the attack more complex, more difficult to achieve. Whereas attack complexity specifically will mean that there are active protective measures that were put in place on purpose to make exploitation harder. So attack requirements isn't really in control. The attacker can't really control those conditions, whereas attack complexity generally, if it's still possible to exploit, those conditions can be bypassed, but they were put there on purpose. And user interaction, well, now, as I said, we can define whether it's passive or active. The most common example is always XSS. You can have, well, an XSS, if it's a reflected as XSS, you will require some active interaction from the user. You need to trick him with a link with a malicious payload. He needs to click the link, get your payload executed. If you're talking about a stored XSS, the user just needs to unknowingly visit the infected page and you will passively trigger it. And then scope was changed. It was removed here, but just to be actually defined in the impact metrics. And now you can define the actual impact of the scope between vulnerable or subsequent system. Vulnerable system, the system that is directly affected, or if there's a downstream component, the secondary system that you are infecting, then you have the impact on the subsequent system. And this can also be easily explained in XSS, again, because in an XSS vulnerability, you know that the web app that is vulnerable is where that's actually the vulnerable system, where the vulnerability occurs, but in reality, the vulnerability is only being exploited on the subsequent system, the user's browser. So that's where you would define the impact in the cross-site scripting vulnerability. Then the threat metrics group Well, it was now defined. It had a lot of parameters before. Now it wants to clearly define whether or not there is active exploitation activity in the wild. So it can tell you how likely it is that your vulnerability will be exploited based on threat intelligence sources. You can gather information from those and know if there is, for example, a POC for that vulnerability that it's more likely, or if it's currently being attacked for, I don't know, maybe using KEV database or something, some other source that can tell you. And this will usually change over time, of course, because exploitation can be something one month, the other month can be different. Environmental metrics, I won't dive that deep into this because they are pretty much the same, just with some better clarifications about how to use it. But the supplemental group is an entirely new group that should actually be filled by the provider of the score, and it would allow even to give more characteristics about the vulnerability, even a better context. Although its focus is usually more related to the operative technology, industrial control systems, where we could add even more information if that's the case, if it makes sense in a given scenario. But this is actually to be filled by the provider. And safety here would mean actually if you could kill someone by exploiting the vulnerability. Okay, maybe I'm getting too far. Kill is often not the case, but at least if you can cause some injury to a human actor, that's how we would define safety. Then automatable is your system bricked. If you exploit a vulnerability and, sorry, that's for recovery, not for automatable. I meant automatable is if you get the capacity to make your vulnerability wormable, for example. If you can automate it, you will define it as yes, as being present as a characteristic. Recovery, actually that's what I meant, is your system brick would be the question that you ask, and that would be a recoverable scenario, of course. Value density, you can define it if, for instance, let's say you have like an Active Directory instance that you will exploit in this vulnerability for some reason. You know, this is a bit far-fetched, but for some reason you know that you would have control of a lot of resources with that Active Directory instance, that you would be controlling a lot of computers, for instance. Then you would have a concentrated value density, which means that you'll be affecting more resources, so it makes it even more severe. Vulnerability response effort, it's literally how difficult it is to respond to that vulnerability. And provider urgency is something for providers to tell, in their opinion, how urgent it would be to react to this vulnerability. This is actually, according to the guidelines, something that only the penultimate provider should provide. For instance, let's say a Red Hat advisory providing a score for how that vulnerability is particularly affecting the Red Hat users. That would be his role, if possible, to use this provider urgency in the score. And you also have a vector string. Again, this is just the machine readable format for the score for you to be able to represent the score in the format that you can share more easily around. But you again have the base metrics as mandatory. All the other groups are not, don't need to be present. And then you also have the severity rating scale, which is exactly the same. If the score falls in one of those ranges, you can have the qualitative rating. And yeah, sorry about all this technical stuff. I swear I am, especially after a few drinks. But let's not talk about that. I want to go more practical now, because I know it will be less boring. So let's look at this example. We have even before we see the score, let's try looking at the information we have. So we have an ARP cache that can be spoofed. We can just put a spoof IP in that table, in the ARP table in this Juniper router, and cause a denial of service to that user IP. And also the attacker could redirect the traffic to themselves, some sort of man in the middle. And dynamic ARP inspection is enabled by default. This would be the resulting score in version 3.1. We got an adjacent attack vector, we got the attack complexity set to high, and scope is changed, confidentiality high, and availability high. So can you try guessing what would be the resulting score?
9.8?
That would be fun. That would be more fair. At least it's not a 9.8. 7.5. Okay. 7, 8. 8 score beater now 9. No 9s. And we got a winner. I heard another 8. You're good. So I'm not here to talk about that score. Let's now see about version 4. So again, just highlighted here the data we have. So we have, again, our protocol. We know it's an adjacent attack vector. The complexity is high because we have dynamic ARP inspection enabled. This is, as I told you earlier, our active protective measure to try to prevent exploitation that the attacker will need to circumvent. So this is now more clearly defined in the attack complexity. We now know that we have vulnerable and subsequent system. So in reality, now we can define that the vulnerable system is only impacted with a low impact on integrity because it's just the ARP table that is being spoofed. So that's the only impact we have on the vulnerable system, but the real impact is on the subsequent system because the user would have his service denied. So it's a high impact on availability, and also there is the attacker being able to read the traffic, so a high impact on confidentiality as well. And could you try guessing now what would be the resulting score, version 4? 8. 7.5, 8.5, I heard a 6 somewhere. 8.5, okay. Let's see, 5.3. Yeah, I will let you digest this and let's look at another example now. So this is just a made-up example. Well, quite lame, but the idea is that we will look again at a comparison between between versions. So read and write in this config directory in the web app. Well, you can then achieve remote code execution on the host system, and there are again some protective measures to try preventing against the RCE, some ASLR enabled and data execution prevention. So again, looking at the CVSS vector in here, what do you think it would be the resulting score?
9.8.
Okay, I heard the 8.5, a lot of 9.8s. Well, quite close, everyone. It's a bit higher than before. Still a high score, but again, let's not dive too deep into this. Let's look at version 4. So we know the read and write, access on the config directory. Okay, we can here define some low impact on the vulnerable system, on all the CIA parameters, because we can read and write on that directory, but it's very limited to that directory only. Again, the highest impact is on the subsequent system, because we get remote code execution, of course. we have these measures, but that just defines again that the attack complexity will be set too high. And given this information, let's play that game again.
7, 4.3, 7, 6, 4.5.
Now you're playing lower, you're being cautious.
5, 7.
Okay, the highest is 7. I heard some 4s, 4s point something, 5. Okay. Now 7.1. Remember, we had a 9, now we have a 7.1. Okay, let's look at it. So attack complexity is still high, and we know that attack complexity will make the attack more complicated. But as we've seen, it's still possible. Those measures can be circumvented. And I mean, we don't know the attacker we have before us, right? So I would always assume that we have the best knowledgeable attacker in front of us. I mean, he can be advanced, he can be persistent, have the best tools in his hand. So attack complexity shouldn't really be a burden to stop this kind of, shouldn't be something that will stop the attack. And then we have vulnerable system impact, all set to low, but still there's some impact in that. But anyway, the subsequent system is all set to high. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. I mean, that's actually where the impact is if you look at it. Because you're talking about someone using the web application, and here that user will have his own operating system being affected with an RCE, which is quite serious in my opinion. So 7.1, that low all of a sudden, I'm not again arguing that it's wrong, but boy, it's confusing, at least. That's how I feel about this core. But let's see a bit more about CVSS version 4. And CVSS came with the idea to reinforce that CVSS is not just a base core. So you should be using all the other parameter groups. You should be using environmental, threat, supplemental. Everything else should be used to get the best score. Finer granularity through the addition of new elements. We've seen this. Adding more metrics should give us more granular scores. Then they enhance the impact metrics by now having vulnerable or subsequent system that you can define for impact. Also, they want to promote more accessible information exchange, having more parameters even that can bring more information about the vulnerability, maybe tell a better story. Overall, more clarity, more ease of use. This is awesome, right? Yeah, I wouldn't go so fast. At least let's look at it deeper. And I want to talk first of all about open source really quick. So we all know that open source is philosophical, philanthropic, magical. Everyone is using open source. And according to this study, we get an estimation that FOSS is constituting like 70 to 90% of any modern software solution. And that's really a lot. If you look at a Gatsby package, an NPM package that is used to build web frameworks, you get all these dependencies in a single library. And this is, just imagine all the libraries you're using in your system. You can control probably 99% of these direct or even actually the transitive dependencies you get through this. So it would be naive to think there's not at least one vulnerability, but I would say like hundreds, if not thousands of vulnerabilities in your project. So again, is CVSS v4 a solution for this? Well, back to the colors. You can use them to group the vulnerabilities by severity, but you still don't know in reality how likely it is that your system is going to be exploited. You don't really know the context of how the vulnerability will behave in your system. You don't know if it's indeed exploitable with all the security controls you have in place. So we get often to the idea of using CVSS for risk assessments or vulnerability assessments management, and these terms are often used interchangeably. But this is, of course, wrong assumption number one. One thing is classifying severity of vulnerabilities, another thing is the risk you could assess, and another thing is using that in your vulnerability management program, maybe. So, again, I'm sorry. For the next slides, I'm going to use some memes, but that's just for demonstration purposes to make the image a bit more clear, more understandable what I'm trying to convey. So the first issue, in my opinion, is misunderstanding the purpose of CVSS. And this is kind of obvious, and it's related to the idea of what we saw of, well, assuming the wrong thing, like CVSS can be used for risk management, or CVSS is risk management. That's of course wrong. As we've seen, CVSS is severity, and that's a different thing. Another problem is lack of adoption. Lack of adoption is still real. Of course, adoption takes some time, and here we can assume that we are already adopting or wanting to adopt. But lack of adoption stems first from a lack of awareness in the beginning. Then awareness starts to happen slowly, but in reality, it's hard. It's hard that everyone will suddenly change and start using a new version, having to adapt, especially in your organizations, all the processes that you already have. And also, well, there's also time, of course, it takes time for adoption. So that's why we're still seeing adoption, and it grows more and more as the time passes. But also maturity is involved here. It's complicated in reality to make this change if your organizations are not ready and there isn't enough maturity in the programs, the processes, or anything else you have that will actually make the adoption go slower. But there was also the fact that even providers took some time to adopt, or the models we are already following, those we look up to. Even, for example, NVD took some time to start having scores. A lot of known advisory providers took a long time also to start having CVSS v4, and providers, CNAs in general. But also, again, you shouldn't be relying on CVSS alone for risk vulnerability assessment. You can use it for that purpose, but it's not the same thing. Shouldn't be used together. And even worse is using only the base group. This is like the worst practice you can have, because as we've seen, CVSS is much more, or should be much more than that. And in practice, in reality, it's much harder because vulnerabilities, as you know, are complex. You can have a lot of nuances that are difficult in reality to translate into the actual scores that you're trying to classify. And, well, I wanted to make the score precise and customizable, but in reality, it might have introduced even more complexity into the score, actually also more subjectivity with the more characteristics you have and all these different parameters that now have more options. And the more vulnerabilities you have in reality also will increase the complexity. One thing is 3 vulnerabilities, another is 300. And again, maturity plays an important role in here, because especially medium to small sized organizations will have even a harder time with this. Also, limited information. It's a huge problem, and of course, limited context. This is obvious. If there is no limited information, you won't have enough context, but it's a problem if providers aren't providing enough information to properly rate the vulnerabilities. If consumers are not helping providers help them provide enough information to be used. And this can be even a bigger challenge if we're talking about OSS libraries, as we've seen all those dependencies being used. But in reality, if your context is limited, but even if you have more context, you never know how your library will in reality be used. Everyone is using it differently, all the use cases, all the ways it can interact with other libraries in that system. That will be a limitation here. Also, score over inflation. This tends to happen because if you have limited context, you need to, well, calculate the score according to the context you have. So you would have to assume the worst case scenario, and this is actually a good practice. But the bad practice about this is that it will be often misinterpreted to use that worst case scenario for the impact, and also to start extrapolating about the understanding you have about the worst case scenario. So often people giving the scores will start assuming other things in the part of the exploitation and the impact it will have that are actually not being described, and that goes beyond the worst case scenario, and the scores will even go higher. But also, well, we have the case of the vulnerability reporters, bug bounty hunters that will on purpose try to overinflate the score because higher rewards, higher financial and reputational rewards, but actually some bug bounty platforms are trying to counter that by creating penalties if you miscalculate the scores. And manual can be a hassle. Automation is not always possible. It's a matter of balancing or finding where you can actually have both, but it can be sometimes also a limitation. Time versus quality, of course, classical, but you can, again, focus all your attention in one vulnerability on that ball. But if you're having a lot of vulnerabilities, you will have eventually to sacrifice the quality of the scores you're providing. And willingness to do things properly, this is something as well. Of course, if you're not really willing to understand how to use the score, both as providers or as consumers, and this, of course, will require focus, direction, learning, can be complicated as well. But also sometimes it's not just willingness, it's incapacity as well. If you're, again, coming to the problem of maturity, if you don't have enough maturity, maybe it's not just that you're not willing, it's that you don't have the resources or currently the capability to start properly using the score. And having to rely on both provider and consumers, because you do have providers need to provide the base score and eventually the supplemental now. And consumers are the ones that should provide this with to themselves as consumers, the threat score, the threat group, and the environmental metrics. So you do have to rely on both, and because there is no way around, it can be a problem if one of them is not willing to do, even if it's just one of them. And actually you are depending on the availability of each other in the end to have the best scores possible. And also consensus is something that, well, if you're having to rely on both, imagine that you need to understand what is really the vulnerable system or the subsequent system or the impact that you will have on both. It might actually depend from the standpoint of the provider or the consumer according to what they have. So there might be some problem here to reach a consensus. And another issue is, of course, some neglect, fatigue, and discouragement in the open source. This for scoring, of course, open source libraries, because this is real. And it's the fact that most of the times open source providers, people that have projects, are not really interested about vulnerabilities in reality. They are interested about delivering functionality, about improving their projects. So it can also be a limitation. And now I would like to see if we can actually tackle some of the challenges. We can, some here underlined, of course, because we can possibly solve all the limitations. But first of all, accept CVSS for what it is, of course, because CVSS, as we've seen, is to rate severity. It's never too much to stress this out. CVSS is a tool, not an entire solution. And of course, you can use it for risk vulnerability assessments, but you need to use other stuff. You can't just be relying on CVSS for that. And never too much to stress it out. And then the second thing that, in my opinion, is vital is, of course, that you will fully use the CVSS v4 capabilities. We've seen it's not easy, but that's the way to go, because you have the base core, but you should know how to use it properly. As I've said, if you don't have enough information and you need to provide the worst case scenario, you should be careful about the impact. Let's say you have a vulnerability that if you exploit it, you will gain access to some clear text credentials. That's actually the only impact that you will have there. You can't start suddenly imagining that in that vulnerable system, you will be able to use those credentials to log in some command prompt and suddenly get an RCE and put that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability will be all high. But this happens a lot, actually, and this is wrong. If you don't have more information than the one you're having for the vulnerability, then you can start assuming things. Clear text, only impact is confidentiality. And threat metrics, you should use them, as we've seen, to provide more information about the current state of exploitation from what you have happening in the wild. Then environmental metrics, also to be filled by consumer, to provide characteristics that are particular to that consumer's environment. And usually these don't tend to change over time. They might, but the idea is that they are very particular to that consumer's environment. And this will actually allow the consumer to change the score to better reflect how it's impacting his system and not in general. And then we have the supplemental metrics also if we need to provide even more information about the vulnerability. It might be on specific industries, but it might be also relevant in other cases. And of course, providers, especially the entities responsible for disclosing vulnerability information, should be providing as much information as possible, because in the end, well, we need that context, and even open source advisories, everyone dealing with open source vulnerabilities now is relying on CVSS scores also. It's also important to prioritize those because we've seen everyone is using open source most of the times, whether you want it or not. And again, not everything can be automated, but you should be using automation whenever possible, of course, making it easier to deal with all those vulnerabilities. And actually, providers can't really automate that much to provide base scores or supplemental metrics, but consumers can and should automate in environmental metrics using threat intelligence sources automatically to be constantly understanding how the vulnerability is being attacked in that moment. Or you can also use environmental metrics in reality as well in an automated fashion. And that would be, according to official guidelines, using an asset management database. It's defined on the specification or the user guide documents. And what this means is that you would have a database for each asset in your company, in your project, wherever. But if you keep all those assets in a database, you can define how that asset is in reality being affected in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability, in case it will be affected. So let's say you have an asset that doesn't have any sensitive data, any sensitive information. That would mean that even if a vulnerability will impact that asset and that vulnerability has a high impact on confidentiality, in reality, that vulnerability doesn't matter to that asset, so it's irrelevant because you define that that asset has no impact on confidentiality. And then exposure will allow you to tell whether that asset is internally or internet facing. So this can be very useful to help automate the assessment of the environmental metrics for a consumer. And with the fucking source, of course, because, well, sorry, the source contains pretty much everything you need to know, almost, of course, but you have very important specifications, like whether there is the difference between a confidentiality and integrity requirement versus availability, which is something that usually we don't think about, but it's worth reading, and a lot of other stuff. It's quite complete. It might help. It will certainly help a bit. So what comes next? Well, first of all, try to strive to make the adoption easier. We should, as providers, as consumers, try to help providing better information, better tools, making everything more accessible so the adoption will go faster. But actually the main sources we're consuming, they should be the ones adopting first and helping the other entities to also adopt. And that also means that providers and consumers should be cooperating. Of course, more cooperation is essential to achieve a better context, to have better scores in the end. Then more transparency. It's all about transparency about that information, the vulnerabilities. If you are reporting vulnerabilities, disclosing information, you should try to provide as much as possible, because that's the only way everyone will achieve fair scores and have the best scores possible. And Mitra is actually taking a very interesting step in encouraging now CNAs to provide as much details as possible, because in the past you would see a lot that everyone that was disclosing a vulnerability, and especially CNAs, which is even worse because they are authorities in creating CVs, they would just leave all the work to downstream augmenters like NVD. So they wouldn't just care and wouldn't even provide a CVSS score. They would just leave it to NVD. But NVD is already, of course, acting on limited information. And the providers, the CNAs, are the ones that contain the most information. So it actually makes sense that they will be the ones providing that information, that they will be the ones assigning the scores. So Mitra is now encouraging that will happen. And also there's an interesting official guideline for a CVSS extensions framework. And this is actually something that allows you, if you're dealing with other systems like industrial systems, healthcare, automotive, or anything else that is a bit odd or outside the regular CVSS definitions, that you can actually even create more characteristics and more parameters and metrics. You have good guidelines about how to do it properly, so we'll be able to have even that additional information and reach better scores for that. And, well, of course, always, whenever possible, try to collaborate with open source communities. Very interesting, the CVSS community itself, not just the community, it's actually the special interest group, which they are the first, the officials from first who are owning and managing the CVSS standard. So you can be part of it, and if you are part of it, you will be helping improving CVSS and creating improvements for the future versions, future releases, version 4.1, eventually a version 5 that is already being discussed, and constantly making it more clear, finding ways to improve adoption. So that will help a lot. And, well, that was everything I had to say. Hope you enjoyed it. So thank you all for coming, and now to the questions.
So how does it go from the string of potential whatever it is to the number? What's the...
Oh, You mean if you have like the vector in the string, the machine readable format?
Yeah. How do I go from the human readable? It's this or this or this.
Well, you should use the calculators. Actually, most of the calculators, even in the URL, if you go to the calculator and you put that string, the CVSS string, you will get the output. But actually, I didn't see how good are now the tools for version 4.1, but I know that a lot of them allow you to just do that conversion, because actually the calculations are very complex and difficult to emulate yourself.
So the formula is at the stack.
Is the formula published and transparent?
Yeah, the formula it's transparent, but there are a lot of things that are very complex in the formula. They are using advanced mathematical equations that I don't know if you can't really know if it's good or not. You just get a point where it's very statistical and like how certain parameter groups influence the others. If you have certain group of parameters, you might have a different score if you didn't have that group present, and a slight change might affect a lot how that combination with the other combination of parameters will provide the final score. It's very complex.
Here, we got the microphone.
Yeah, you got the mic. Yeah.
My question is, throughout the talk you mentioned adoption.
Sorry.
Struggling a little.
I didn't hear the first word, sorry.
Throughout the talk you had said that you were like adoption for this was struggling.
Yeah.
But in my experience, like every single vendor and tool
Yeah.
is adopting it. So
Yeah.
where's the critical point that you're saying it's like, is it NBD or
No.
the issuers? Where's the adoption from?
Yeah, so I didn't meant to say that it's struggling. I meant to say that adoption takes time, and that can be a limitation at this moment if you're trying also to adopt it and to start using it. Because if not enough providers are using it, if you don't have enough scores, or there aren't yet enough tools to be using it for you to use it properly, then that can be a limitation. But I said that is actually constrained to time. So the more you will adopt it, the less it will be a limitation.
Maybe I guess.
Just here first, because there's a, please. You had a mic, yeah, you can speak.
The base score of version 4,
Yeah.
is that more accurate than version 2.1?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I showed you the examples. I had that in mind also for you to try to understand by yourselves whether it's more accurate or not. But in reality, it still leaves room for doubt whether it's more accurate or not. I think that what you can understand at least is that you will have more granularity in the scores, and you are not having a lot of overinflated scores just by using the calculation itself, just by providing your parameters and having the final score. At least not everything is a 9.8 anymore. But whether it's more accurate or not, you would actually have to have a lot of vulnerabilities and assess them, and then start comparing in relation to each other. I know actually that FIRST is trying to do that. So not even FIRST in reality is aware whether the score is much more precise now or not. And that might be something that if you realize that it's not that precise, that you would have to improve for version 4.1.
So now to continue on the question, right? I guess when the talking about adoption, where I see that could be, delay is not on the vendor side who have security tools that they are, the vendors that have security tools will probably adopt it sooner compared to, suppose, say, a company like an organization which is a CNA, which publishes vulnerabilities on their products, but not a security vendor, but their own product CVs that they are, as a CNA, they are publishing. They might adopt 4.1 much later. Maybe that's what I see from an adoption point of view. Might take more time than the relevance.
Yeah, it could be something. It could also be a conditioning to adoption. Could condition the adoption, yeah. But yeah, I think that plays a role, but it's also a matter. I think maturity really is important, because if you're not mature enough, it will take longer to adopt. But as I said, adoption is only a problem at a given time, not forever. Eventually, adoption will start to happen more and more. Actually, it's just a wild guess, but if I were to guess, I would say that by the beginning of next year, that you will see pretty much all the entities already having it adopted, or all the bigger core providers, at least. About consumers, that's another question. That's an additional challenge. Yeah, we don't have time for another question. Just one more. Okay, we need to go. Sure, we can talk afterwards. I'll be outside, so if you have any other questions or anything you'll like to discuss. Thank you again.